Richard Thomas walked away from the role that made him famous, and for years, nobody outside his closest circle understood why. He was John Boy Walton, the earnest, bookish eldest son whose voice narrated an entire American mythology of family, faith, and hard times survived together. Audiences loved him. Networks wanted him. And yet, in 1977, at the peak of his fame, he told CBS he was done. To understand why an actor would leave the show that made him a household name, you have to understand what the Waltons actually was and what it slowly began to cost the people who lived inside it, season after season, for nearly a decade. The Waltons premiered in September 1972, created by Earl Hamner Jr., who based the series loosely on his own Depression-era childhood in rural Virginia. It was, by the standards of 1970s network television, a strange gamble. Gentle, slow-paced, deeply sentimental, and set against the backdrop of the Great Depression and then World War II, the show had none of the gloss of the era's bigger hits. Critics initially dismissed it, but something about the Walton family, their poverty, their closeness, their unshakable decency, struck a nerve with a country exhausted by Vietnam and Watergate. Within 2 seasons, The Waltons was a top 10 show, and its cast, largely unknown before the series began, became some of the most recognizable faces in America. That fame arrived fastest and heaviest for Richard Thomas. He was 21 when the show began, already a working actor with off-Broadway and film credits, but nothing that prepared him for the scale of what John Boy Walton would become. He won an Emmy for the role in 1973. His face was on magazine covers. Fan mail arrived by the truckload. And, according to interviews Thomas gave later in his career, including a lengthy oral history recorded for the Television Academy Foundation's Archive of American Television, the very success of the role became the reason he needed to leave it. He has spoken candidly about wanting to be seen as an actor capable of range, not a single character frozen in amber. John Boy was, in his own words, a young writer trying to find his voice in a hard world, and Thomas, the actual young actor playing him, was trying to do the same thing in his own career, just off camera. By the time Thomas made his decision, he had also started a family of his own. He and his first wife, Alma Gonzalez, had triplets in 1975, and the demands of a grueling television production schedule, often running from July through the following spring, began to weigh against the demands of being present for his children. This wasn't a secret grudge against the show. Thomas has said in multiple interviews over the decades that he left the Waltons with gratitude, not bitterness, but that 5 years was enough for him to feel he had said everything he could say as John Boy. He wanted Broadway. He wanted films. He wanted, as many young actors in his position did, to prove there was more than one character living inside him. His departure at the end of the 1976 to 1977 season forced CBS and the show's producers into a decision few family dramas had faced before: recast a beloved lead character or write him out entirely. They chose a middle path. John Boy was sent off to New York to pursue his writing career, explaining his absence within the story itself, and the role was eventually recast with actor Robert Whiteman for the final 2 seasons. Whiteman has spoken publicly, including in retrospective interviews with entertainment outlets covering the show's legacy, about the near-impossible position he was placed in, stepping into a role that audiences had spent 5 years falling in love with someone else playing. Ratings dipped. Longtime viewers wrote letters expressing confusion and even anger. It wasn't personal against Whiteman, who by most accounts handled an unwinnable assignment with grace, but it revealed something television executives hadn't fully reckoned with. Audiences weren't just attached to a character. They were attached to the person who had originated it. Richard Thomas's exit, however, was only the first thread in a much longer story of loss that would define the back half of The Waltons. The show's emotional anchor, in many ways, was Michael Learn's portrayal of Olivia Walton, the family's steady, principled matriarch. Learn had come to the role after a career in regional theater and had, by her own account in interviews given over the years, initially been wary of the wholesome image the role might trap her in. She stayed for 8 seasons and won 3 Emmy Awards for the part, but by the early 1980s, she too began to feel the pull toward other work. Rather than simply having her character disappear, The writers built Olivia's departure directly into the plot. She was diagnosed with tuberculosis and sent to a New Mexico sanatorium to recover, a storyline that mirrored, in an almost eerie way, the real emotional reality of an actor stepping back from a role that had defined nearly a decade of her life. Learned has described in later interviews wanting new professional challenges after playing one character for so long, a sentiment nearly identical to the one Richard Thomas expressed years earlier. It's a pattern that repeats across the show's history. Gratitude for what the role gave them, paired with an artist's restlessness to be seen as more than one part. Ralph Waite, who played family patriarch John Walton, had perhaps the most complicated relationship with longevity on the series. Waite remained with the show for most of its original run, but during the 8th season, he too stepped away for a stretch, pursuing directing work and other projects, before returning for the 9th and final season to help bring the series to a proper close. Waite's own reflections on his years on Walton's Mountain, shared in interviews over the decades, including with the Archive of American Television, painted the picture of an actor who deeply respected what the show represented, but who, like his younger castmates, needed room to grow beyond it. Unlike Thomas or Learned, Waite's connection to the Walton family extended well past the camera's stopping. He would go on to be remembered by castmates as a mentor and a steadying presence on set, and his eventual return for the finale was, by all accounts, an emotional homecoming rather. Not every departure from the Waltons was a matter of choice or ambition. Some were far harder and far sadder than any career decision could ever be. Geer, who played Grandpa Zebulon Walton, was already in his 70s when the series began, a veteran stage and screen actor whose life prior to the show had included being blacklisted during the McCarthy era for his political associations, a fact that made his later life embraced by mainstream American television audiences almost poetic. Geer brought a weathered, lived-in warmth to Grandpa Walton that audiences adored. But age and health caught up with him. He suffered from respiratory illness in his final years, and in April 1978, Geer died. The show did not recast the role. Instead, the writers folded his death into a storyline honoring the character, allowing Grandpa Walton to pass in a manner that let the cast and audience grieve together, on screen and off, in real time. It remains one of the most quietly devastating moments in the show's history, not a plot twist, but a genuine goodbye. Grandma Esther Walton, played by Ellen Corby, suffered a loss of a different, but equally painful kind. In 1976, Corby experienced a serious stroke that affected her speech and mobility. Rather than write her off the show, the production made the difficult but compassionate decision to write her real medical condition into the storyline, having Grandma Walton suffer a stroke as well and slowly recover on screen, mirroring Corby's own rehabilitation in real time. It was an unusually honest choice for network television at the time, and it allowed Corby to remain part of the Walton family both narratively and professionally even as her health declined. Tragically, in 1983, after the original series had ended but during production of a reunion television movie, Corby suffered a second stroke, further limiting her ability to work, and she would pass away in 1999, remembered by castmates as fiercely dedicated to the role even through significant physical hardship. Her story is less about an actor choosing to leave and more about an actor fighting, with real courage, to stay. What emerges from all of these stories, Thomas's ambition, Learn's restlessness, Waite's need for space, Geer's mortality, Corby's declining health, is a portrait of a show that was, in its own way, as demanding and unforgiving as any long-running family saga could be, even while it depicted gentleness and simplicity on screen. 9 seasons is a long time to inhabit a single character, let alone a character as beloved and closely watched as a member of the Walton family. The actors who played the family were, in a very real sense, living 2 lives simultaneously: the fictional hardships of Walton's Mountain during the Depression and the very real pressures of fame, typecasting, aging, and health that came with being part of one of American television's most enduring ensembles. It's worth remembering, too, that The Waltons was never just a show to the people who made it. Many of the cast members have spoken over the years about how deeply the values of the fictional family bled into their real relationships with one another. Judy Norton, who played eldest daughter Mary Ellen, and John Walmsley, who played musically inclined son Jason, both remained with the series for its entire run and have spoken in later interviews and at cast reunions about the unusual bond the ensemble shared, one that extended well beyond the sets in Burbank. Cami Codler, who played youngest daughter Elizabeth, was only a child when the series began and grew up largely on that set, later reflecting in interviews about how the show shaped her sense of family as much as it shaped audiences' expectations of what television families could look like. For the actors who stayed the full 9 years, watching colleagues depart, some by choice, some by heartbreaking necessity, was its own kind of ongoing grief, a slow unspooling of the ensemble they had built their professional lives around. By the time The Waltons ended its original run in 1981, it had already weathered more real-life loss and transformation than almost any other family drama of its era. And its legacy didn't end with cancellation. The cast reunited multiple times throughout the 1980s and 1990s for a series of television movies, allowing audiences one more visit to Walton's Mountain and allowing the actors themselves, many of whom had scattered into different corners of the industry, one more chance to step back into the family that had, in ways both wonderful and complicated, shaped the rest of their lives. Earl Hamner Jr. continued to speak about the show until his death in 2016, always describing it not as a piece of nostalgia, but as an honest attempt to depict a family that loved each other through real hardship, the same hardship, in different form, that eventually pulled his cast in different directions. What lingers, decades later, isn't really the mystery of why these actors left. The reasons, when examined honestly, are almost achingly human. The need to grow, the need to be seen as more than one role, the toll of age and illness, the simple fact that 9 years is an entire chapter of a life. What lingers instead is how much care both the actors and the writers took, again and again, to let those departures happen with dignity, writing illness into storylines rather than erasing characters, allowing grief to be acknowledged rather than hidden, giving audiences the chance to say goodbye the same way the Walton family always said goodnight to one another, one by one, with warmth, before the lights went out. That, perhaps, is the quiet reason The Waltons still matters. Not because nothing ever changed on Walton's Mountain, but because when it did, it changed the way families actually change, with love, with loss, and with the hope that goodnight was never really goodbye.